Anna, can you see me? Anna, all right, you can hear me? All right, thank you. Welcome back to all of you. This is week 4 of the EDL 740 Intro to Graduate Research Zoom session. Tonight, I am beaming to you from Dallas, Texas. I've actually been in Shreveport for the last couple of days working directly on campus. I don't think I saw any of you there, but you don't live there, most of you. We're halfway home tonight in the 7-week term. And I know the pace has been pretty quick, but at least in my classes, I can't speak for the other classes. You pretty much know what's coming week by week by week, and it doesn't vary a whole lot. On that topic, really the only way it does vary is in week 7. As you know, and I've said before, but I'll keep saying it, we will not have a Zoom session on week 7, but you will have the final exam. And you already know exactly what that looks like. I hope you're already working on it so that it doesn't prove to be a huge monumental add-on for your week 7 work. And a reminder too about week 7 is your submission deadline for your assignments is going to be on Saturday evening instead of Sunday. So it gives me all day Sunday to try to grade your stuff so I can post the grades on Monday. On week 1 and week 2, I gave you some gentle reminders and bumps when something wasn't quite meeting my expectations, and I would tell you what it was, gave you the feedback, and then I would say you're welcome to try again if you want to improve your grade. You're not going to get those gentle bumps from me anymore. Hopefully, if you've been paying attention, you now know the drill. But if you end up getting dinged by me and you get less than the grade that you want, if you'll ping me and try, I'll give you the opportunity to try again for improvement if you want to. The initiation of that process now belongs to you and not me. With regard to the grades, it's those dad-burnt APA citations. They just shouldn't be that hard, should they? I've said it before, I'm not a purist by any stretch. Those of you that pursue your doctorate eventually will most certainly get a taste of what the APA purists look like with your dissertation committee. But I do want you to get in the habit of appropriately attributing credit for content that's been created by someone. It's just respectful for you and me to provide the appropriate recognition and credit to the creators, and it's a courtesy for you and me to provide a nice clean pathway for other learners like ourselves if they want to examine the same content. So remember, it's who created it. That's always first. Last names, first initials. Persons. If at all possible. It's just really rare that you don't find the name of the person or persons that created the content. The next part is the when, what year was it published? And the third part is what's the title of the content? And then the fourth part is where can other learners like you and I find it? Either if it's a web posting, then you provide the URL. If it's a hard document, then you either provide the book publisher, or if it's a journal, then you provide the name of the journal. If it's a journal, you need to also cite the specific journal and the page numbers in the journal. But those are the 4 things I'm looking for. So when I ding you for the APA citations not correct, what I'm telling you is I'm not seeing those 4 pieces of the puzzle. Get them right, please. And really, that should be the easiest part of what we're doing, but you'll get there if you want to. Now, some of you have gotten, several of you have gotten feedback from me in the grading stuff, and I said this was adequate but not substantive. I didn't just pick that language out of the air. That language is found exactly on the rubric, the grading rubric in your syllabus. There's a little more language there to be more specific, but if you have questions about that, you can look on the syllabus. But let me give you an analogy in relation to that, adequate but not substantive. Let's say you told me in one of your responses on your top takeaways on a particular piece of content that what you learned was that the difference between boots and flip-flops. Well, that's minimal. yeah, I'm glad you learned the difference between boots and flip-flops, but that's a pretty minimal response. If you extended it just a little bit, and you told me something about the actual differences between boots and flip-flops, then you would probably get from me that, okay, that's an adequate response, not substantive, but adequate. But if you went a little further and you described for me the rationale about why that was important learning for you, then you would likely receive the best grade possible, because what you've done is you put a little meat on those bones. I know you're all busy. I know you got families. You got full-time jobs. Some of you have more than one job. But please give me evidence of some real deep and critical thinking in your responses. Let's talk about your proposal questions. Yes, I'm noticing some of you in this week's discussion forum I've asked you to extend on that process a little bit. And yes, I've seen that some of the questions are already beginning to be massaged a little bit. If you're objective, here's another analogy for you with regard to your proposal questions. Let's say you decided that you wanted to study the impact of fruit on the human digestive system. That's pretty broad. Lots of different kinds of fruits, and there's lots of humans, lots of age ranges, styles, kinds, locations, geographies, genetic makeups, and the whole work. So that would be a very broad question if you were trying to study the impact of fruit on the human digestive system. You could tighten that up a little bit. If you tighten that question up, then you could say you were going to study the impact of apples on the digestive system of humans. So then what you did is you eliminated a whole bunch of other fruits. So that would tighten your question down. You could tighten it down a little more even by saying that you were going to study the impact of apples on the digestive system of humans who've been fasting for 12 hours or more. Okay, that would be a tighter question. You could tighten it up further. You could say, I'm going to study the impact of Fuji apples on the digestive system of female humans between the ages of 20 and 30 who've been fasting for 12 hours or more. So each time you tighten that question down, and here's my point, each time you tighten the question down, you make it easier to conduct your study. Each successive tightening of your research question makes it incrementally easier for you to tease out some specific data and then draw some conclusions from that. The tightening of the question usually tightens the data collection, which tightens the conclusions. This kind of sort of gives you an idea of how you can choose a question that builds on the previous work in a particular field of study. So one of the reasons I make you do the research mining every week, not only to get you familiar with the structure of research, but I also let you poke around in areas of some interest to you. But it also gives you a view into the breadth of the kinds of research in all kinds of areas. Really, there's not hardly an idea or a thought or that humans can think of that hasn't been researched, if you can find it. And if you're really going to conduct a study, then you would want to know what other research in that area has been done. The lit review will be very helpful for you in that process. And believe it or not, there's a lit review module coming to a Moodle platform near you soon. We will spend an entire week talking about lit reviews. Let's talk about the qualitative versus quantitative thing, the nuances they seem to be becoming more apparent to you all, which I thought would happen, particularly as this week we've been, in week 3, we took a very deep dive into the qualitative stuff. And then this current week, week 4, we'll be taking a pretty deep dive into the quantitative. But you've seen through your comments, both in your learning task responses and also in the discussion forum, you all seem to be getting a much better grasp of the differences of those two research tools, the qualitative version and the quantitative version. Obviously, I think to all of you now, the qualitative is a bit more flexible in its nature. And as particularly after this week 3, I think you see that the sampling recruitment strategies that you would use for a qualitative study versus a quantitative study are distinctly different. Dennis made an interesting connection in relation to the qual versus quant thing, and I'm going to quote him exactly because I thought it was just, I've never heard anybody put it quite like this, but Dennis said, for example, the quantitative approach is similar to lesson planning. We use pre-test and post-test and other pre-existing data along with the scope and sequence provided by the state to help us develop the appropriate plan. In essence, it's highly structured in nature, whereas the qualitative research is like the actual teaching of the lesson, meaning it's flexible and can be adjusted according to how the students are absorbing the information. I've never heard anybody put it quite like that, but that's a great way, an analogy for the qual versions of research tools. Thanks for that, Dennis. I love it when people say stuff that makes me think. In relation to that, I hope you all are taking time to look at the discussion forum post of your classmates and to stick your nose. I'm forcing you to stick your nose a little bit in the collective learning stuff, but the student-to-student learning, just like in your classroom, you all will learn as much or more from each other as you ever do from me or from the content even. And because we got some really sharp cookies in our class, so please take the time to take a look at what they're writing and saying, and feel free to comment, particularly in the discussion forums. I've been seeing some of you go above and beyond a little bit, commenting some on the contributions that some of you put in the forum, and that's perfect. I love that. Obviously, I'm not one of those professors that gives you a grade in regard to that. Maybe I should. I don't know. From what to think to how to think. That resonated with many of you from week 2. And my goal in that regard is to push you just a little further than you've been before. And mostly to try to foster in you the habits of critical and collective thinking. And they are habits. Being analytical, being curious, being skeptical, being interactional, and cross-pollinating thought are really habits that you and I can develop within ourselves if we take the time to think about it. But you got to slow down a little bit. You got to put the cell phone down. You got to get in a quiet place to do that most often. What and how much you learn really is driven by you more than anybody else. By design, I'm taking a very andragogical and pedagogical approach to this course. I think I've talked to you about those words before. Just think of them as being on the same continuum with pedagogical, just in on a different end. Back on that how to think versus what to think concept, those apply to school leadership. And I continue to think of all of you. It doesn't matter whether you're CNI folks or MEDL folks. You are leaders on your campuses, and you will continue to be leaders. And the more you learn, and the more you share that learning with others, the more you will be viewed as leaders. But as leaders, you and I are obligated to try to create the conditions that foster organizational health and well-being. Just like you and I are responsible for the health and well-being of our personal bodies, once you move into those leadership roles of an organization, then you become responsible for the health and well-being of the organization. And organizations are just living, dynamic creatures. And so one of the things that I think is very important for you and I to do as leaders on campuses is to make sure that we make it safe for people to take risks in the process of their work. In essence, that's helping them, that's teaching them how to think when we give them the latitude to take risk in that work. Some of you, I know from your comments, seem to be working for some school leaders that are willing and even encouraged to let folks take risks and encourage you. Some of you in my internship class clearly are working for some school leaders like that. Let's talk a little bit about the research mining. Um, let me say it again at the risk of beating a dead horse. I want you to stick your nose in actual studies, not journal opinion pieces, not blogs spaces, not chapters of books. I want you sticking your nose in some actual research studies for those learning tasks 4 and 5 every week. And if you don't, you're going to hear from me about it. It seems to be getting easier for you on the research mining, and I knew it would every time I teach this course. You know, week 1, there's a fair amount of gnashing of teeth and tearing of cloth for biblical quotation. I suspect a fair number of you are now using the collective learning piece to see where others have found work. And yeah, of course you should. That's perfect to look back and see where others are digging out research and finding something useful. Also on the research mining, quite a lot of the studies are designed to test for the efficacy of a specific product or model. And that's because us professor types, particularly those that are tenure tracked, they're required to do research. And so a lot of folks in the field, professors and non-professors, are trying to create a better mousetrap. That's what they're really doing. And so they're going to develop a piece of software, or they're going to come up with a theoretical model, or they'll design some sort of interventional process that they think it will work. And then they'll create a study to test the efficacy of that model or that product. If they can show efficacy, in other words, if they show that this interventional model that they created is working for English language learners, for instance, that seems to be an interest of several of you. Then what they'll do then is they'll use the results of that study as a marketing tool. All in the interest of making money for themselves, by the way, but we'd like to believe that truly at the heart of their work is improving outcomes for students. But you'll find a lot of studies around, particularly around that kind of stuff, that are designed around a specific kind of product or model, and that's why that exists like that. Katie mentioned having, I can't remember if it was discussion post or in the collective learnings, but she mentioned having had 11 principals and 18 years of service. You know, and that, Katie, that's, God bless you, by the way. That's far too common. And I'm sure some of those principals burned out. I'm sure some of them got fired. I'm sure some of them got, I'll say, promoted to central office. And I'm sure some of them actually moved on up the food chain because of their proficiency and prowess. But it's a very common thing for school leadership. I call it the churn in the school leadership. And you all will be, those of you, particularly in the MEDL folks that aspire to the school leadership, you'll become part of that churn most likely. But my point, here's the point I want to make with you all about all this, because at the end of the day, you and I are in the business of creating better futures for children. And the only way we can manage to do that, thinking again through the lenses of school leaders, is the effectiveness of the schools that you and I are leading. Whether we're leading from the department or grade level perspective, or whether we're leading from an administrative perspective, whether we're leading formally or whether we're leading informally. But the effectiveness of the schools that you and I work in are grounded in the quality. It's directly proportional to the quality of the people that are working in the school. So you and I as school leaders should always be in the business of seeking out and trying to add talent to our team. So there's two questions that I like to pose to folks like you. The first one is this: why would talented people want to work with me? Ask yourself that question and think about it pretty carefully, if you don't mind. Why would talented people want to work with me? Am I doing the things, am I behaving in the ways, am I modeling the kinds of things that would cause talented teachers and educators to want to come play with me? And then the second question, why would talented people want to work in our school? What about our school serves as a magnet for those talented kind of people that will cause learning to happen for youngsters? So those are not yes/no questions. Those are reflective questions for you and I ask about ourselves and about the culture of our school, because you and I are uniquely situated to do something about both of those. We can have an impact on whether or not we are a magnet for talented people. You and I can have an impact on whether or not we help our school become a magnet for talented people. Because the more of those people that we can attract and hire and hold, the better our schools are going to be. On the research mining, I'm changing gears just a little bit. That was preaching, and I'll pass the plate a little later in the session. But some of you are coming across studies where they did a pilot study first, and that's a fairly common thing. Not so much in qualitative research, but particularly in quantitative research, is the researcher thinks they may be on the trail of something, and so they'll do a pilot study with a reduced sample set to see if what their hypothesis, to see if what they think they're smelling out has any credibility to it, and if their pilot study shows a little bit of significance, that's the technical word that we use in research, that significance thing, then they'll launch a much broader and more expansive study right along the same lines and using the same research question. If their pilot study fizzles, then they'll conclude, now it's really not worth investing the time and the money to try to dig into this with a much larger study. You all, I think, are already seeing in your research mining a pretty wide range of quality in the research, and that's to be expected. It's like everything else on the planet. There's a whole continuum that runs all the way from crappy to exemplary. But one of the things, one of our goals in this course is to help you become much more astute in being able to make those judgments about the efficacy of the studies. I want you, when you're looking at the collective learnings of your classmates, notice the wide array, the wide variety of takeaways that you all are taking from some of these pieces of content. What resonates deeply with one, another one doesn't even mention, and what one of you finds not very beneficial, another one of you says that's one of the most important things you learned in the whole thing. So that's what constructivism on display, because all of you came to this course from a different place in your learning journey, and presumably you'll take something of value out of it, but it'll be very different than your classmates. Tool talk. Let's talk about research tools. And that was one of the things I pitched at you this week on your discussion forum. Many of your research questions are aimed at tracking change over time in some way, which is fine. That's good. And we call those longitudinal kinds of studies. Maybe it's a reduction in discipline referrals or improvement in student achievement or teacher retention or something. But what you're doing is you're taking a look at sort of a pre-test concept and then a post-test later, but you're taking a look at a group or a concept or an intervention at before, and then you're tracking over time the exact same sample set to see the efficacy of the intervention or whatever it is you're studying. Those are longitudinal studies, and sometimes those are longitudinal in nature. Now, a different version is the comparative groups, where you have the research group you're looking at, and then you have the control group, and that's done in quantitative research, in which you have two very similar but distinct different groups that you're trying to run these comparisons on. But one of the issues of that, obviously, is if you're doing the longitudinal studies, is the variation of your sample set, because you're always going to have kids leave or get sent over to the alternative education center or whatever. So your sample set almost always, on a longitudinal study, the sample set will almost always shrink on you some. Some cases it shrinks quite a lot, but you hope it doesn't. But you're going to lose a few out of your sample set, and that's to be understood. And that's one of the things that you would make note of when you're speaking about the limitations in that portion of your research. When you're laying out, you're stealing the thunder from your critics. You're letting them know, yeah, I know exactly where the weak spots are. But those are part of the challenges and barriers when you try to do research, longitudinal kinds of research. I think the discussion forum question I pitched at you this week is asking you specifically the kind of tools you thought you might use to pull off your research. The data collection piece is huge. And as I mentioned in my analogy about fruit and the digestive system earlier, the tighter your question, the easier it is for you to identify the specific tools you want to get the kinds of specific data you want. Exceptional school leaders are always collecting data, both formally and informally. And in the best schools, I just finished reading a very nice and short book by Robert Marzano titled Becoming a High Reliability School. And he laid out just an excellent framework for school leaders to use to have a very methodical process of not only establishing what it is you're going to measure, but then monitoring that and then making adjustments after you've monitored. So it's a continuous improvement cycle. But the best schools and the best leaders are always in the business of collecting data and analyzing that data, and the very best ones are always doing it as teams, not as individuals. A notable difference in the qualitative and quantitative thing is this. In the qualitative, we allow the participants a great deal of latitude in defining or explaining their experience. In the quantitative, we, by the nature of our surveys and our questions and the ways we allow them, the participants, to respond, we put them in very tight boxes. And so when we're creating the questions and tools that we're going to use and deciding on the tools we're going to use for quantitative, we're sort of hemming in the participants to specific kinds of wording or answers that we have preconceived. Well, that's easier to measure. It's easier to put in spreadsheets, but it's easier to put in rows and columns when they spit that back to you. But for those of you that have done your income taxes, and I suspect most of you have, I would almost bet money when you're trying to respond to the federal government's need for your money, you find yourself staring confused with a confused look on your face at a particular item on that tax return. And because they give you 2 or 3 options, you got to pick one of them, but there's not one of them that actually describes your situation. And so that's exactly what you and I do with quantitative research. We predefine the kinds of answers that the respondents are going to give us, but we have to understand that the respondents may not actually fit in those boxes that we've created. And that's one of the reasons that qualitative researchers prefer to go with the much more open response kinds of formatting. But what that does then on the qualitative, it's much more subject to the biases of the researcher. Because when we're reading intuitively the data, rather than putting aggregating and disaggregating data on spreadsheets and with rows and columns, when we're interpreting that data as individual researchers, then there's a lot of opportunity for us to misinterpret and there's a lot of opportunity for us to impose our biases onto our conclusions. It's probably becoming pretty obvious to you that a good qualitative study takes time, quite a bit of time actually. Time for the data collection, time for the analysis, and also time for the coding, time for the teasing out of the conclusions, time for the follow-up interviews if you're going to have them. It's a booger. It's really, the quantitative is a much quicker route if time is a problem for you. One of my dear friends and mentors is very fond of saying that in the quantitative research, one of the nice things about it is you can just keep massaging those numbers until they say what you want them to. And in one sense, Archie's right in that regard. As you're studying quantitative tools this week, you'll find there's like a bazillion tests and tools that quantitative researchers use to massage the numbers. And there's very rational and ethical reasons for them wanting to massage the numbers, typically, but they're trying to tease out the nuances of their data and so that they can draw some kind of meaningful conclusion. But in Learning Task 3.1, I'm changing gears on you a little bit again. Kristen noted the importance of the qualitative in explaining the experiences of the participants. Absolutely. We use the how and what stems for our research questions, and I think most of you have moved away from the why. We use the how and the what as the initial word in those research questions most of the time to help us get to the why. Bonnie commented on the importance of ethics in the qualitative stuff, and there's some very she's spot on. There's some very tricky boundaries, particularly if the researcher chooses to move into and live in the environment of the participants. That can be, we see this in anthropology, anthropologists work all the time. It provides some very tricky ethical considerations if you choose to try to move into the environment in which your participants are working and just be in you want to be an objective observer, but it's almost impossible for that to happen if you actually inhabit their space in which they're living and working. There's not just a few researchers that have crossed some boundaries when they were trying to conduct qualitative research, but something we have to guard very carefully against. In Learning Task 3.2, several of you seemed to enjoy Albert Einstein's quote that not everything can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. I have loved that quotation and have used it for years. I've shared with faculties when we were engaged in the messy work of trying to improve student outcomes. It's easy sometimes to want to seize on the stuff that's easy to count and make it more important than maybe it is. And it's even easier sometimes to want to ignore the stuff that's the hardest to count, even though it may be the most important stuff. One of my favorite authors is Peter Senge, S-E-N-G-E, and he calls it that stuff the soft data. And Senge says it's the hardest data to collect, it's the hardest data to measure, but it may be the most important data to the effectiveness of your organization. We're now in week 4, talking quantitative stuff this week, and you'll get to see a lot of massaging techniques. Good for you, though. I mean, we're on 7-week terms, and good for you. We don't. I mean, if you choose to pursue your doctorate, you're going to get an entire 3-hour course, at least one of them, on quantitative tools. There are tons of ways to massage those numbers, and they keep coming up with more. Pearson test, ANOVA, you name it, all kinds of them, chi-squared. And quantitative researchers will try to isolate variables, and they'll shrink the time windows, and they'll do all kinds of fancy footwork with those numbers. An example of that, I don't know if any of you are news hounds or not, but about every month, the U.S. government comes out with a jobs report stuff, and they are always manipulating those numbers, and usually the numbers are manipulated by whoever's in the administration that's in charge at the moment, because they're always massaging the numbers, regardless of what's happening in the jobs reports. They're massaging those numbers to show the most positive spin, to show that the nation is doing quite well under their guidance and leadership. Each week I pitched 2 or 3 books at you that came to my mind while I was reading your stuff. And as you know, you can find those on my website, www.nelsonwcoulter.com. I have a page dedicated to book recommendations. 3 books that came to mind while I was reading through your responses so far this week is I'm a great fan of Dr. Howard Gardner out of Harvard. I'll read anything he writes and have. But in 2004, he wrote an interesting book, which was sort of a diversion from his typical interest. But the title of the book was Changing Minds, the Art and Science of Changing Our Own and Other People's Minds. It was really an exceptional work, particularly those heading into administration. You might want to put your nose in that one. One I read more recently was actually from a professor out at Stanford, a theater professor named Patricia Madsen. And the title of that book was Improv Wisdom. And it was, she teaches improvisational comedy for theater. But and I love improv comedy. But I've read more than one book on that topic, and I really believe that it's worthwhile for those of us that think we presume to lead other people. It's worth our time to study the tactics of those improvisational actors, actresses, and comedians, because it can really help us, I think, build bridges with people that we're trying to work with and we're trying to influence. And finally, a 3rd book that came to mind was a 2004 copyright by the late Dr. Stephen Covey. The title of it is The 8th Habit, From Effectiveness to Greatness. Dr. Covey got rich on one of his initial works called The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. Some of you are probably using that work in your schools with your students. His son has turned that into a pretty nice cottage industry of teaching students how to manage their lives more effectively. But Dr. Covey, after that 7 Habits thing, did so well for him, about 15 years worth actually. He dug back into it, and he decided that he felt like there was an 8th habit that he missed the first time around. And the 8th habit is finding your voice and helping other people find theirs. It's really a good book. If you were only going to read one of Dr. Covey's works, which I hope you won't, just read one. But if you were only going to read one, read the 8th habit. It'd be well worth your time. Okay, boy, I've burned up 40 minutes of your precious time, and nobody has posted a question yet in the chat box. Come on. Let me kill my notes here so I can see the faces of those of you that showed up tonight. And you can ask me questions if you want to, either orally or in the chat box. I am at your service. I work for you. Believe it or not. And you can send the checks to, no, I'm kidding. Okay. Mary, which book? There was 3 books. Howard Gardner, Changing Minds. Dr. Covey, The 8th Habit. 8th Habit. Thanks for asking. It's really a good work. But I love everything he's written. Too bad we lost him. He's a great thinker. Good leader. Other questions you all have for me? Hey, Teresa, score. Yeah, I love all of Cubby's work. Okay. We'll give you just a little more wait time. Give you a chance to run spell check on your question before you send it, post it. There's a question about, can you start the internship in the second session? You can start, I assume you're talking about the second term this fall in AP2. And the answer to that question is yes, but you can really start the internship at any point in time. But the first step in that is for you to work with Monica Pels, P-E-L-S, our graduate. I feel like you've all had interactions with Monica. She's golden. Jiminy Christmas. We should bottle her up and sell her. Jiminy Christmas. She's good. But whenever you think it's time, you think you're ready to start the internship, make sure you're working with her, because she's the one that's going to make sure that you're following your degree plan and trying to get you graduated on the schedule that you have expressed as your goal. And by the way, some of you will be graduating in December, and I intend to be there in my goofy looking gown, like right with all those other professors. Other questions? I hope, by the way, those of you that are graduating and do show up for graduation, I hope you'll take the time to come speak to me when you're there. I'll shake your hand or hug your neck, whichever you want. I'll let you initiate, and I'll follow the lead. Okay. Well, come on. Borrow some money, catch a flight, or hitchhike. Yeah, you could do that. I think I've said this to you all before, but you have no idea what an honor I view it as to be able to go along with you on this learning journey. I think, if you reach out to me either via email or Moodle Messenger, or even those of you that have my cell phone number, which I can't imagine that any of you don't. In fact, I think I had my Google number on my website, maybe. But anyway, I'm not hard to get hold of. If you reach out to me, you're going to hear back from me in a hurry. Use me as you need me, now and even after the course is done. I will see you in Zoom session 5 1 week from tonight. Thanks for being here tonight. Good evening.